this chapter, as you know, was called Reflexive Monism and the Ground of Being. And basically, this was an invited chapter for a book, forthcoming book, which will be published next year, which was edited by two people who've been very much involved in, well, for many years, really, in looking at phenomena which don't fit into mainstream views of what reality is like. And the name of this book is going to be called Consciousness Unbound. And basically, the idea in this is that consciousness is more widely distributed in the universe, shall we say, than just in human brains or even in brains. And in previous work, they've produced loads of evidence for this. But what's been somewhat lacking, if you like, is a kind of explanatory system for understanding this wider range of phenomena. And they did produce one book called Beyond Physicalism, which is kind of beyond reductionist materialism, the idea that there's nothing in the world other than material stuff, some years ago. And this is a follow-up book where they invited other authors who had been working on similar themes, and maybe to try and push the whole conceptual framework of our understanding further, and hopefully towards a greater integration, so that it would be, if you like, a kind of understanding that doesn't in any way deny any of the science that we all value, and is mindful of all the philosophical problems which surround these kinds of questions, but nevertheless hopefully moves us a bit forward. So basically what the chapter aims to do is to expand on this different way of thinking about things, which I've called reflexive monism. It's something I've been working on for decades, really. And in the broadest description, it's really a kind of way of understanding reality as a self-observing universe. So it's kind of a universal picture, but the notion is that we're embedded in a process, if you like, whether we realize it or not, where this reality is, so to speak, engaged in a process of observing itself in a multitude and infinite number of ways. And the aim of the chapter is to expand that in a way that still makes complete sense. It's natural. It doesn't try and reduce our understanding to just a bit of what we know, for instance, what the physical world is like, but it ignores what we are like, and avoids all the main pitfalls of alternative philosophical systems, which I don't go into too much in the paper, but I mention, I try and give little vignettes of what they say. And in trying to do this, I'm just feeding into something which is very ancient. It really goes back to the dawn of human history, recorded history anyway. And for example, it's the same enterprise in a way, which you find inscribed above the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, with the inscription, "Know thyself." And ultimately, one is trying to answer in this kind of enterprise the question of, who am I? You know, what's real? How do I fit into this reality, and so it's trying to answer a fundamental existential question, which arguably all humans face. And of course, the ancients already had produced deep insights into that, and you find them, for example, in the Upanishads, and I've just picked a couple of examples, where there's a kind of mysterious but deep saying, thou art that, tattvam asi, which captures, if you like, the essence of a realization, but of course the words themselves don't tell you much. But translated, it just means you are that which is. And then, of course, the question is, what is that? And we're going to talk a bit about that. And other ways of saying that is, I am Brahman, which you get in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads, and sometimes consciousness is Brahman, although that's actually more complicated than maybe it sounds. Once one moves beyond, if you like, these deep but simple one-line expressions, and look at the ancient Western tradition of trying to make sense of all that, and move on, say, to the ancient Greeks, you find that they start to divide our own nature up into, if you like, distinguishable aspects. So you start to get versions of the term mind, as well as the term consciousness, and within the philosophical systems also discussions of the nature of self, and sometimes they talk about soul, and basically part of their enterprise was to work out how mind, consciousness, self, and soul relate to the workings of the body, the brain, and the rest of the physical world. But often some of these terms were mixed up with each other, so they weren't used, if you like, in clear, consistent ways of the sort that we would expect, shall we say, in modern science. And in particular, there wasn't a consistently clear distinction between consciousness as such, mind as such, and soul as such, which in the modern context have become rather important. But you find certainly Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and many of the others talking about all these things. And running through the entire intellectual enterprise, from the ancients onwards, and that's both West and in the East, there were this fundamental question of whether the first three terms, mind, consciousness, self, and soul, related to one kind of reality, and body, brain, and the physical world related to another reality. And if you believe that really there were these two universes, or these two fundamental realities, then you wind up with a version of what's called dualism. And if you say, look, they seem to be different, particularly in the way that we normally think about it, but ultimately these are either the same or aspects of the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that's the same thing that, which you might call the ground of being, or there are lots of other terms for it, which we'll come back to. And you say there's just one fundamental reality, then you're a monist. So there's this ancient debate between dualist positions and monist positions. And as I say, that occurs in Indian philosophy, for example, as well as in Western philosophy. So Samkhya Yoga philosophy is fundamentally dualist, and Advaita Vedanta non-dualism is fundamentally monist. And I'll talk a little bit, but not a lot, about that later on, just because of limited time. And if we move from, if you like, these lofty, questions to something really simple, we get to the place where my own work in this area starts. And that's with what I call the reflexive model of perception. Now, at stake here is something really straightforward, which is a question of how do three things shown in this diagram relate to each other. Where in this diagram, the cat is what is a representative of the physical world, if you like. Here we have an observer, a perceiver of the cat. And here we have the observer's experience. And that's a typical way that we talk about this in everyday life, or and it's also an ancient position in Western philosophy, where if you try and capture the relationship between these three, the idea is that within the physical world, which is here, there are light reflectances off the cat's surface, which stimulate the visual system of the subject, and that produces neural representations of the cat in the subject's brain. And then something else happens in the brain, which we still don't fully understand, which provide the conditions for the experience of consciousness, the neural causes and correlates of consciousness. And a result of that chain of action, you wind up with an experience of the cat. And we talk about that as a percept in the mind of the subject. And that's a dualist way of looking at things. And the reason it's dualist is that if we look at what's below this green line, the cat is physical, the light rays are physical light rays, this body, this head and the brain of the observer is physical, but it produces, the interaction between these physical things produces an experience. And within a dualist way of thinking, that's in a different universe, or it's a different kind of thing altogether. It's not physical, it's an experience, and which is the percept in the mind of the subject. And it's split in another way too, which is represented by this line. So this is the object, which is over here. Everything on this side of the green line is the object, and everything on this side of the green line is the subject. So there's a subject-object split in this way of looking at reality. Now, that's regarded, the notion of a separate world, if you like, a consciousness world, which is outside of physical reality completely, has been largely rejected in our own culture as something which you can't really understand within science, because if this is kind of in another world, you can't measure it, you can't observe somebody else's experience, you don't know how something like as different to a physical world as a world of experience could possibly interact with something like a physical world, and so on. And so a large effort was devoted in Western philosophy to trying to establish this kind of picture as being more or less true. And in this picture, you still get the physical cat in the world, you get light rays, as before, producing a neural representation in the brain, and then something else in the brain happens which will allow an experience of the physical cat to occur. And from the subject's point of view, it seems like as if the experience is, a percept in her mind. But science will show that actually this is nothing more than a state or function of the brain. And that's called materialist reductionism. And there are various problems with that too. I won't have much time to go into it. But one thing I want to point out is that although there's no longer a split between that and these, it's all physical, there's still a separation here. Everything on this side of the line is an object, and everything on this side of the line has to do with the subject. So there's still a subjective-objective split. Now, I really don't want to get into an evaluation of dualism and reductionism as thought of in these terms. I've done loads of work on it in my books and whatever. And I really want to get into what's different about what I want to say. Because rather than get into a critique of the other positions, I want to say something really basic, which is I think they misdescribe conscious experience, both of them. And in order to grasp what I'm saying here, and this is a really important conceptual move, and a lot of people find this really difficult, even though it's really simple. And the reason that they find it difficult is because it's a different way of thinking about something really simple. Is let's say we replace the cat out here at the moment by this screen that you're looking at. And you ask yourself, what is my experience when I look at the screen? What's my visual experience when I look at the screen? And you say, well, okay, dualism says that's a physical screen out there in the world, and my experience of the screen must be nowhere. It's if you like, in another universe. And reductionism would say the experience I have of this screen is just a state or process in my brain. Is that how it appears to you? And I would say that actually what you actually experience visually isn't like either of those things. If you're like me, and I'm sure you are, what you actually perceive as you look at the screen is a picture of a cat and, a head and a diagram out there in space on the screen. That is your visual experience. There isn't another visual experience you're having. You might be having thoughts, your body, other feelings and so on. You might have memories and so on, but your visual experience, that's the only visual experience you're having. And the rest is a theoretical fiction. Now, that's a fundamental shift. It's a bit like saying, look, the world isn't flat, or the sun doesn't go around the earth. In this case, it's much simpler because you can ask yourself, you can examine your experience and look for a visual experience that's any different from the one that I'm describing. And I would say that you won't find one. And then you get into the business of saying, well, how do you represent that in terms of this basic question of how do physical things, there really is something out there in the world, and I really am something over here, and I really am having an experience of something out there. Sort of goes like that. Well, most of the story scientifically is the same as in the other two models. So there really, in this model, is there is an entity out there in space. There is, in the case of what you're looking at, a screen out there really is there, and that light rays are really coming from it, to your eyes, and your brain is definitely doing something. And as a result of your brain doing something, you're having an experience of it. But you're having an experience of it, more or less, where it actually is. So it's reflexive, moves back on itself. And that's why it's called the reflexive model of perception. The same thing happens if you touch your fingers together, for instance. You feel tactile sensations in your fingertips. And you ask yourself, well, where's the sensation? And is it in your head? Is it nowhere? And actually, if you're just being honest, you would have to say, well, I can feel the tactile sensations at the end of my fingertips. And then you think, well, how does it get there? I mean, the actual neural conditions for having that tactile sensations are in my brain, but the experience is down in the fingertips. It's reflexive again, and you can tell that story for the whole of experience. And what the paper then does is to give a brief summary of something I've done lots of work on in the past called perceptual projection, which is just naming this phenomenon of how does something that actually stimulation or activation in my brain produce an experience of something that doesn't seem to be in my brain. And basically it's naming a phenomenon. It's a psychological phenomenon. It's not denying the science, and it's not a theory about what's going on. It's simply a description of what's going on. And I should stress that I'm not suggesting that something physical is being projected from the brain. This is a subjective psychological effect, but nevertheless real, and is fundamental to how the mind works. And then you can produce a whole range of evidence of cases where which demonstrate this phenomenon. And again, I have got time to go through that in this introduction, but I've given you just one, what I think is very persuasive demonstration of something that seems so odd being real, and that is just virtual reality. So here we have the same diagram, where instead of this is no longer a real cat out there. What the virtual reality system has done is to project onto a pair of goggles images of what a cat would, the light patterns that a real cat would project onto the left and right eye. If I can find, yeah, of the goggles. And as far as the subject's brain is concerned, she receives the same information from the goggles that she would receive if she were looking at a real object out there in space. And not surprisingly, what her brain then does is to process it in the same way and produce the same conditions to allow conscious experience to develop. And she sees it as a cat out there in space, just as if you go to a 3D cinema and you see something out there in space. And that then becomes a metaphor for what's actually going on in ordinary perception. So there is a sense in which this world around us is a kind of virtual reality. It's not a virtual reality in the sense that there isn't anything there. In this case, the virtual world models energies and events which actually are there, according to the way that I would develop this theory. Nevertheless, if you buy into this, you've already immediately stepped into a different world. Simple though the step was. And the first thing that you realize is that what you normally think of as a physical world, which is actually, from where you're sitting, the computer you're looking at, that's a physical thing. Your body extending to the floor and so on, is from another point of view, an appearance. It's actually a model of what's there. It's not the reality in itself. And that actually means that if you're just looking at the phenomenology, the actual experience, what we normally think of as the physical world, which is, as I say, just the screen you're looking at, and the rest of the world surrounding it, is actually part of conscious experience. It's not apart from it. It's one section of it. And you can have other conscious experiences at the same time, like thoughts and feelings and so on. But there isn't a split, if you like, between the physical world as we perceive it and what we normally think of as being the physical world. And so the entire, that's right, this whole debate, which assumes there is a split, is starting in the wrong place. And if you start in the wrong place, you can't get to the right place. And just going on a bit from there, you can say, well, it's yes, the world out there is what I normally think of as the physical world, but of course it's not the same as the world as described by physics. So the world as described by physics is quite different. It's, you know, quantum energies and it's full of information and energies that I don't even perceive and so on. And then you can say, well, yeah, all that's true, and nothing in this denies any of the findings of science. And basically, what I normally think of as the physical world is just a biologically useful model, which we've developed through long process of evolution, which allows us to engage with the world as if the world as it appears to us is real. That works perfectly well in everyday life. And to all intents and purposes for everyday life, it is real. But it isn't the thing itself. It isn't the ultimate reality. And so philosophically, that produces a position which we can describe as indirect realism. You know, there is something really there. Experience is represented, but not absolutely, not directly. You know, we've got to be a bit critical about it. We've got to be a bit, you know, careful about it in making assumptions that, you know, what we perceive is just what is, and that's the end of the story. We know that isn't true. If we believe our own science, we know that isn't true. And that, you know, the chapter then, you know, draws out some of the implications of that, but then starts moving into what are the broad implications, what are the big visions at stake here in terms of the things we want to understand, which is that ancient question of how does consciousness, mind, and what we might call soul relate to something that we think of as body, brain, and physical material world surrounding them. And really what I'm going to do now is just contrast these three big global world views. And the first world view is the dualist view. And basically within dualism, for substance dualists, the notion that there are two fundamentally different substances in the universe. Consciousness and its contents exist in an immaterial realm that has no location or extension in space. They form one part of a dual universe, the other part being the material world. In this vision, the extended material world lies beyond the boundaries of consciousness and interacts with it. However, consciousness is not in any sense contained by the material world. So we're talking, and this in the modern Western context, you know, would be a version of Descartes' view. And in ecclesiastical terms, you know, the world of consciousness, soul, and mind would be, if you like, the areas dealt with by theology, and the material world is left to science. That's dualism of that particular kind. And then we have the broad materialist reductionist reaction to that, mainly driven by science and the philosophy which supports that science, which suggests rather that consciousness and its contents are nothing more than selected states or functions of the brain, which have causal interactions with other non-conscious states or functions of the brain. Viewed this way, consciousness and its contents form only a small part of the physical universe and occupy little space. That is, conscious neural states or functions are parts of rather small brains that make up a minute proportion of the material of the earth, which in turn is a tiny fragment of an immense non-conscious universe. So, according to that view, this is basically a non-conscious universe we're living in. If you like, non-sentient, empty of consciousness, and they're just these tiny pinpricks of consciousness in very small beings, you know, located on, you know, just a few planets maybe, and it's so to speak a dark universe with tiny pinpricks of light. That's basically where you get to in this view, and we're still struggling to find whether any other consciousness or even life exists on any other planet in the universe. Reflexive monism is a very different story. So, and I haven't yet given, you know, a justification for this story, just the beginnings of it. But according to reflexive monism, the reflexive dual aspect nature of the human mind, and I'm going to explain what that means in a minute, is just one natural manifestation of the universe in which it is embodied and embedded. So I'm saying, look, we're just natural expressions of what the universe is like. We're not unnatural. And, you know, exceptions, tiny exceptions, as materialist reductionism would suggest. And the contents of normal phenomenal consciousness, exactly what we've been talking about, are neither beyond three-dimensional space, as the dualists assume, nor are they contained within just tiny bits of three-dimensional space occupied by brains, as the materialists assume. Rather, these contents define and fill what we think of as three-dimensional phenomenal space, as they are none other than the everyday phenomenal world or universe is normally experienced. In other words, the very notion we have of three-dimensional space is based on the world as we normally experience it. And then, as I said before, this normally experienced phenomenal world is only a partial, approximate, and species-specific model of the greater universe described by physics and other sciences. And this excludes, this is our model, you know, what our normal perceived world is, excludes a far greater set of entities, events, and processes within the external world, body, and mind. There's much more going on than we experience. And given their close linkage to consciousness, it's of particular significance that the operations of one's own mind-brain are largely non-conscious. So we don't even know what's going on in our own minds. Metaphorically, the contents of consciousness have often been likened to the tip of an iceberg, but the bulk of the mind, like the iceberg, remains unseen below the water. And now we have a picture of it. So, you know, there's this is, if you like, the conscious bit. And this is the personal unconscious bit, you know, below the waterline, as the iceberg is. And that in turn is embedded in the sea. So, you know, why doesn't reality seem you know, like that? And well, that's simply because most of the rest of reality is unconscious in our normal experience. But what is unconscious now is this sea of energy and information, if you like, you know, both relating to our own minds and the surrounding world. So if you now switch, if you like, almost to a physics picture and think of our own physical being as being this dance of energy and information, which is, you know, configured together in a particular way to make a body, and the other surrounding world as other configurations of information and energy, which in turn form those entities. And if you also accept the fact that we're awashed, we're literally lodged within this sea of energy and information, and together the whole thing forms a kind of unity. I haven't established that yet, you know, within this introductory talk, but that's one thing that the chapter does. You get onto this alternative, you know, into this alternative picture, which I stress I haven't yet justified for you, but I'm simply presenting it to you. That there is just this sea of information, energy, and it has a particular characteristic, which forms these different, if you like, vortices or patterns within it, you know, which we think of as entities, which have in turn the ability to look around and experience the rest of the universe in a particular species-specific way. And in engaging in that normal human process, we actually engage in one aspect of a much larger process where that's what the universe does. It forms into these clumps of energy and being and so on, which in turn experience both themselves and that which they're embedded in, or some version of that, depending on the nature of the entity and so on. And therefore engage in a process where the universe experiences itself. And then what the chapter does is to go into the details a bit more. And I'm just going to say a few things about this because we're going to get a bit technical, and I really don't want to go on much longer, you know, and open things up to discussion. That if you actually start to get into the details of it and say, but what's the nature of the human mind? And how does this all work? In our case, for many years, I've developed a view which you would call dual aspect monism, which actually originates in the work of Spinoza, but is you know, developed in particular ways, where you say, well, if let's say you're trying to know the nature of my mind, you know, and you are trying to do it with a scientific coat on and trying to investigate my mind from the outside, then all you would see from where you're sitting would be a brain. And so if you look in one way, the brain just seems to me material, because all you can see is the body and the brain. And the brain is as close as you can get from the outside to somebody else's mind. You can't observe their experience from the outside. But if you ask the person what's going on in your mind while I'm observing what's going on in your brain, then all they would be able to say is, well, okay, now I can see something, now I'm having a thought, now I'm having an emotion, and so on. All they can do is describe their conscious experiences. And of course, to them, their conscious experiences represent what's going on in their own minds. And then basically the model I develop is one where you say, look, both these stories tell you something that's important about the nature of mind. And both that from the outside, it looks like the operations of a brain or some other physical system. And from the inside, it just seems to operate as experiences. That's all you know about it, really. And somehow the actual nature of mind must be something that embodies both these things. It must be something that gives rise to both these things, looked at from different perspectives. And so I introduced this idea that the nature of mind is actually psychophysical. It's as much one thing as it is the other. And the nature of the human mind, you know, the mysterious nature of the mind, grounds, if you like, you know, both its material aspect and its normally experienced aspect. And you know, we can think of it as a psychophysical form of human information processing. And then again, this is going very quickly, but just trying to give you a broad picture. The same pattern applies within this story at different levels of manifestation. So, for example, if you go all the way to a simple cell, which is actually extremely complex, from the outside, it just looks like a very complex material form, and really amazingly complex processes go in cells. They're little beings, really. And in this way of looking at things, one is completely open to the idea that it might be something like to be a cell. And again, you know, it's, if you like, a little psychophysical being, so to speak. And when they all come together to form a human body and brain and so on, you get a much bigger psychophysical being. And to put this philosophically, it's like an inverted triangle, just as I've got there. You know, the ground, the supporting bit of the ground of the triangle is at the bottom. This is the, you know, the and then you get the two aspects of it, which would normally be the base, but it's inverted, would be the manifest aspects of it. So it's a dual aspect monism at all levels of manifestation. That's where the chapter goes, although I haven't taken you there properly, just indicated where it goes. And then you get to the question of the ground of being. Now, one thing that does seem to be the case, coming from science, is that as you get more deeply into microphysics, into quantum mechanics and so on, the nature of physical being seems to change in very fundamental ways, and physical forms become progressively more interconnected, for example, and unified. And there's a whole range of deep physics which leans in that direction. So quantum mechanics, for example, would you know, has various phenomena such as entanglement and so on, or the notion that an individual quantum is, you know, in a sense everywhere, as well as eventually in one localizable place. Even deeper, you have string theory. You actually have recently holographic theories of what the universe is like, holographic cosmic theories of space, where within a hologram, there is a sense in which three-dimensionality of things is contained in two-dimensional surfaces, but this is kind of repeated throughout the whole of space, and there may be different forms of interconnectedness. Again, these are, you know, still advanced areas of science, but basically the idea is that the deeper you go, the more interconnected it gets. And there is also in my work a deep principle which actually comes, which I haven't really given you a proper justification for, which is that if you look at the whole process of manifestation, and how the material world and conscious experience relate in this manifestation. And I'm simply stating this to you. I haven't justified it for you or explained it to you, but it's simple. that what consciousness does is to realize the universe. And all I mean by this is that it's only when you become conscious of something that it becomes subjectively real for you. I mean, there are all sorts of things going on in your own minds, for example, which are real enough, but they're not realized. And it's only when you experience them for yourself that they become real for you. And the same applies to this screen that you're looking at. While you're looking at it, it is subjectively real for you. But what is also going on, which isn't subjectively real, is the quantum mechanical story of, you know, the microphysics which is taking place and so on. But this has a complementary aspect, which is that, you know, not only through consciousness is the material universe is realized, but it's through the material universe that consciousness is given form. So from a kind of formless consciousness, you get into form through these physical manifestations. So, you know, if you form into a human being, you get human experiences. And you know, I really like the yin-yang symbol to express all that, but there's a deep story to tell about all that. And then you get into, well, can we say anything more about the ground of being? And for a start, we have to admit that this is not easy. And I love this phrase which comes from the Bible that in our efforts to comprehend the ground of being, we are, so to speak, attempting to, quote, see through a glass darkly. But that doesn't make the ground of being unknowable in this way of looking at things. Yeah, we may not be able to know it completely and so on, but actually all of our knowing is in a sense an attempt to know more about the nature of reality. And so, for example, the whole of science, particularly in the quest of physics for the ultimates of reality, in modern physics and cosmology, you know, their attempt to find a grand unifying theory in some way that can incorporate both quantum mechanics and relativity theory, for example, and answers in some way, you know, how could this universe have come into being physically, is an attempt from a physics point of view to peer into the ground of being. We can do it conceptually, and that's exactly what I've been trying to do here. I can say, well, you know, let's just look at where we are to begin with. This is our conscious experience. This is the world that seems to surround it and so on. How can we make sense of it? And what kind of universe could have produced this? You know, and so what makes it all comprehensible? That would be a second route. And, you know, the whole of, you know, philosophy over the eons has attempted to do something of this kind. And then, of course, we can also approach it through various forms of first-person inner exploration, which have been the traditional method of exploration in the East, but also in the West. And then I you know, the chapter goes into some of that, but focuses just on this one question of what you might call, of the many, many experiences that are out there, and you know, the many different techniques that people have followed via an internal path. What kind of experiences seem to, you know, stand out, if you like, as fundamental and prototypical? And one of them, if I had to pick one that was largely shared, is this experience of unity. And I have here a famous quote, and you know, which I'm sure many of you will have come across before, and I might have mentioned it myself in previous talk, which comes from William James in 1902 in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he says, one conclusion was forced upon my mind at that time, And my impression, this is when he was having an experience of this kind, my impression of its truth has ever since remained unshaken. It is that our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. Looking back on my own experiences, they all converge towards a kind of insight to which I cannot help ascribing some metaphysical significance. The keynote of it is invariably a reconciliation. It is as if the opposites of the world, whose contradictoriness and conflict make all our difficulties and troubles were melted into unity. It is the opposites of the world, whose contradictory and conflict make all our difficulties and troubles, were melted into unity. But that's not where it ends. There's a whole literature which tries to explore this. And again, I couldn't really go into that in the chapter in any depth. It's an entire literature. But I did find Groff's 1998 book, The Cosmic Game, Stanislav Groff's, rather interesting and useful and relevant to the kind of story that I find makes sense. And what he does in this book is to focus on just, for a start, I should say he's a psychiatrist. He was one of the first people working with LSD and other psychedelic substances when these substances were first released by Sandoz Laboratories. He has 4,000 case histories he can draw on of his own, had access to 2,000 other case histories of other clinicians working with people who, themselves had psychedelic experiences. He also, with his wife, back in 1998, 1998, had reports having worked with something like 30,000 participants in holotropic breathwork sessions, which also can produce some of these experiences. And then he tries to sum it up. What are the essences of the things that people experience? And he says, look, there are basically two types of experiences. And he gives an example of Robert, who is a 37-year-old psychiatrist, reporting his own experiences of the ultimate ground of being. And it's worth reading. The beginning of my experience was very sudden and dramatic. I was hit by a cosmic thunderbolt of immense power that instantly shattered and dissolved my everyday reality. I completely lost contact with the surrounding world. It disappeared as if by magic. At that time, my only reality was a mass of swirling energy of immense proportions that seemed to contain all of existence in an entirely abstract form. It had the brightness of myriads of suns, yet it was not on the same continuum with any light I knew from everyday life. It seemed to be pure consciousness, intelligence, and creative energy transcending all polarities. It was infinite and finite, divine and demonic, terrifying and ecstatic, creative and destructive, all of that and much more. I had no concept, no categories for what I was witnessing. I could not maintain my sense of separate existence in the face of such a force. My ordinary identity was shattered and dissolved. I became one with the source. Time lost any meaning whatsoever. In retrospect, I believe I must have experienced the Dharmakaya, the primary clear light, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, that appears at the moment of death. So, just going back over that a little bit, he talks about a massive swirling energy of immense proportions, a form of intelligence and creative energy transcending all polarities. It was infinite and finite, divine and demonic, it was terrifying and ecstatic, creative and destructions, all of that and much more. And I take my own understanding that it in a sense describes a being, or perhaps a form of being, that the experiencer goes on to identify with the Dharmakaya. And I would also say that that, you know, given its intelligence, creative and destructive potential, and so on, one might best describe this as the cosmic mind. And that's the way I deal with it in my summing up of all this. But there's another type of experience which Grof also says, refers to, and Grof summarizes it this way. This is his summary of it all. And he describes it as, this is the identification with cosmic emptiness and nothingness, described in the mystical literature as the void. When we encounter the void, we feel that it is primordial consciousness of cosmic proportions and relevance. We become pure consciousness aware of absolute nothingness. However, at the same time, we have a strange sense of essential fullness. This cosmic vacuum is also a plenum, since nothing seems to be missing from it. While it does not contain anything in a concrete manifest form, it seems to comprise all of existence in a potential form. And then he records that on several occasions, people who experienced both the absolute consciousness, which I've called the cosmic mind, and the void, had the insight that these two states are essentially identical and interchangeable, in spite of being experientially distinguishable and apparently conceptually incompatible. Sometimes absolute consciousness appeared to emerge from the void, and sometimes the void seemed to emerge out of absolute consciousness. So there is this sense of one form of being with two fundamental sides to it. And although I haven't, and I'm going to stop in a second, I haven't got time to justify this to you, that within the Eastern literature, the pure consciousness really corresponds to what in Indian philosophy is often called witness consciousness. It's consciousness as a witness. Whereas this energy, this fullness, this creative potential and so on is for all sorts of reasons, you know, what I would call the cosmic mind. And in a way, this combination of energy and fullness with pure witnessing forms a kind of primordial dual aspect monism. And of course, at this point, the triangular, we are talking about the base of the triangular, you know, triangle here, so that there is no other than this. And then the final slide, the process of self-realization, if you like, is conceived of within the system as a way of bringing the unconscious ground of being into consciousness gradually. And viewed from an everyday perspective, what's below the waterline, you know, from our own normal perspective, is just the unconscious ground of being. But that doesn't mean that the unconscious ground of being isn't conscious to itself. Of course, in this system it is. And the whole business of realization then may be thought of as extending, if you like, the light of our normal consciousness into what normally is the dark of the unconscious ground of being, and we could call that enlightenment or lighting it up, thereby making it subjectively real. And in this way, you know, consciousness and matter, if you like, reunifying Brahman. That's using the Eastern term. And that's where that story ends.